At 3:56 in the morning, the ground in one of the quietest parts of Australia suddenly moved. No warning, no build-up you could feel, just a sharp rupture deep beneath the desert, in a place most people would confidently describe as geologically dead. Because that movement didn't come from anything new, it came from something ancient, something buried so deep and so old that it predates animals walking on land, predates forests, predates almost everything we recognise as Earth today. And for a few seconds at 3:56 AM, it moved again. If you look at Central Australia on the surface, nothing about it suggests instability. It's flat, dry, broken into low ridges and weathered rock. It feels finished, like whatever built it happened so long ago that it no longer matters. But that's an illusion, because beneath that quiet surface is a structure that once built one of the most extreme landscapes this continent has ever seen. A mountain range that rivaled the Himalayas. You've probably heard me talk about it before. I've already made a full video breaking down exactly how those mountains formed, and if you want that full story, you'll find it linked in the description and pinned comment below. But that's not what this is about, because the mountains themselves are gone. What matters is what they left behind. Hundreds of millions of years ago, deep within the Australian continent, enormous forces built up inside the crust, not at the edges of the plate, but right through its centre. When those forces were finally released, the crust didn't just bend, it broke. Massive faults cut through the earth, reaching deep into the lower crust. Entire blocks of rock were pushed upward by kilometres, exposing material that had once been buried far below the surface. That was the moment those mountains rose. But when the mountains disappeared, those faults didn't. Over unimaginable stretches of time, erosion stripped the landscape back down. Wind and water wore away at the peaks. The towering heights collapsed into rubble, then sediment, then the subdued terrain you see today. Eventually the mountains were erased completely, but erosion only works at the surface. It can remove an entire mountain range from view, and still leave the deep architecture of that range completely intact. And that architecture is still there. Those faults, the ones that lifted a Himalayan-scale mountain belt into the sky, are still cutting through the crust beneath Central Australia. They didn't heal, they didn't disappear, they just went quiet. And for hundreds of millions of years, that quiet has been convincing. It makes the continent feel stable, ancient and finished. But Australia isn't inactive, it's under constant stress. Even though it sits far from plate boundaries, forces are still acting on it from every direction. The slow collision of plates to the north, the spreading ridges of the Indian Ocean, the immense push and pull of tectonics happening thousands of kilometres away. That stress doesn't stop at the edges, it travels, and over time, it builds up inside the continent itself. And it builds far more slowly than most people imagine, not over years or even centuries, but over tens of thousands to millions of years. The crust flexes ever so slightly under that pressure, storing energy in a way that's almost impossible to detect in real time. There are no obvious warning signs on the surface, no constant tremors, no visible deformation, just a slow accumulation of strain locked into the rock deep below. But when that stress needs to be released, it doesn't create new fractures easily. Breaking intact rock deep in the crust takes enormous energy. Instead, it finds something easier. It finds weakness. It finds the scars left behind by ancient tectonic events, exactly like the faults that once built those mountains. So when the earthquake struck at 3:56 AM, it wasn't creating a new fault. It was reactivating an old one. A structure that hasn't moved properly in over 500 million years slipped again. For a few seconds, the crust behaved exactly as it did when those mountains first rose. The same pathways, the same geometry, the same deep structures guiding the movement. The mountains are gone, but the system that built them is still operating. And that's what makes this so fascinating, because from the surface there's no obvious sign of it. There's no dramatic fault line cutting across the land, no towering escarpment or fresh rupture you can stand beside. You could walk across the region and never realise what lies beneath your feet. But at around 10 kilometres down, the situation is completely different. At that depth, the rock is under immense pressure. It behaves differently, not quite brittle like at the surface, not quite flowing like deeper in the mantle. It stores energy. Slowly, over years, decades, centuries, that energy builds as stress accumulates. The fault remains locked, holding, resisting, until it can't anymore. And then in an instant, it slips. The rock on either side shifts by a small amount, sometimes just centimetres, but across a massive area. That sudden movement releases energy in a form of seismic waves, which travel up to the surface. That's what people feel as an earthquake, a brief shaking caused by a structure that's been under tension for longer than human civilization has existed, longer than humanity itself, and in this case, longer than most complex life on Earth. That's the scale you're dealing with, and it's why these events feel so out of place. We tend to associate earthquakes with active regions, places where plates collide or pull apart, where mountains are still rising, where the landscape looks dynamic and unstable. But Central Australia doesn't look like that. It looks quiet, and yet it still moves. Because the forces driving it haven't stopped, they've just slowed down. In regions like this, stress doesn't get released frequently, it builds over much longer periods, and when it finally does release, it does so along structures that are already there, structures that formed in a completely different geological world. So instead of seeing new faults forming, you're seeing ancient ones reawaken, not permanently, just briefly, just enough to release the accumulated strain. Then they lock again, and the cycle continues. This is what intraplate tectonics really looks like. Not constant motion, but long silence interrupted by sudden reminders. And there's something even more unsettling about that, because it means the landscape you're looking at today is not a reflection of what the crust is capable of. It's just the latest surface expression, shaped by erosion, climate, and time. The deeper system doesn't care what the surface looks like. It doesn't care that the mountains are gone. It still behaves according to the structures that were put in place hundreds of millions of years ago. In other words, the continent is still wired the same way it was when those mountains existed. The connections and weaknesses are still there, as are the pathways for movement. They've just been hidden beneath a completely different landscape. And that creates a strange disconnect. You're standing on what looks like a quiet, stable desert, but beneath you is a framework built for extreme deformation. A system that once accommodated massive vertical movement and is still capable of slipping under the right conditions. That's why events like this feel so unexpected. Not because they're rare, but because the surface gives you no reason to expect them. The signals are subtle, the timescales are enormous, and the processes are happening far below where we can easily observe them. But they are happening, and every now and then, that hidden system reveals itself. Not for long, just enough to remind you that it's still there. Still capable, still connected to a time when this quiet stretch of desert was anything but quiet. A time when the centre of Australia wasn't flat and subdued, but dominated by a mountain range that rivaled the greatest on Earth. A time when the crust was actively breaking, lifting and reshaping the continent on a scale almost impossible to imagine today. That world is gone, but its foundations remain, and every earthquake like this is a glimpse into that past, not as history, but as something still influencing the present. Because geology doesn't reset when landscapes change, it accumulates. It preserves the structures of the past and carries them forward, quietly shaping what happens next. Every fault, every fracture, every zone of weakness becomes part of the system that controls future movement. So when you hear about an earthquake in the middle of Australia, it's easy to dismiss it, to see it as a rare, isolated event. But it isn't. It's part of a much longer story, a story that began over 500 million years ago, a story written deep into the crust, and a story that, even now, isn't finished, because the mountains are long gone, but the system that built them is still there. I hope you found this as interesting as I did, and as always, thanks for watching. Before I end this video, I'd like to give a big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Thank you so much to everyone that helps to support this channel.